They called her the Ink Girl, an apprentice rune layer with stained fingers and a cold corner of the rune hall. A woman the council secretary passed in the corridor without looking down. She had maintained suppression seals for 7 years, pressing her stylus to stone and skin and scroll for the state's convenience, never asking what the runes held inside the bodies they marked. She believed, as she had been taught to believe, that she carried no mark of her own. She believed the quiet of her collarbone was her natural condition. She was wrong about both. And a king had spent 7 years feeling the silence where she should have been. What happened when 3 layers of ancient runecraft finally met something older and more stubborn is not the story the council recorded. It is, however, the true one. The 1203rd year of the Ironhold fell in deep winter, 3 nights before the ash moon, and the rune hall of Varric's keep smelled as it always smelled in the cold months: iron filings, lamp oil, and the faint mineral sharpness of old tongue ink, drying on cooled stone. Lyra had been apprenticed to the hall since she was 16. Brought in by Maret, the senior keeper, who had spotted her Reedy's rune script in the keep's lower archives and understood immediately what it meant: that a girl without formal training had taught herself to read it. Maret called her little ink hand and gave her the smallest desk and the oldest styluses, and set her to copying practice inscriptions until her wrist ached, and Lyra had been grateful, genuinely grateful, because the hall was dry and paid in coin and asked no questions about her mother. Most people who knew about her mother asked questions. The rune hall did not. She had spent 7 years earning that silence. Her table sat at the far end of the hall's lower chamber, near the archive shelves that no one else visited because the cataloging system was written in a dialect of Old Tongue that had not been in common use for 2 generations. Lyra had taught herself that dialect by the time she was 19. She had told no one. She kept the knowledge as she kept most things, quietly in reserve, for whatever moment might require it. The archive was where she spent her evenings when the day's inscription work was done, running her fingertips along the spines of sealed ledgers and sometimes, very rarely, pulling one down to read. She had found many things in those ledgers. She tried not to think too hard about most of them. Maret found her there on the morning of the review view, bent over a drying practice seal, the lamp already low. The old woman's eyesight had been failing for 2 winters now, and she navigated by memory and the sound of her own footsteps, but her hands were still steady when she set them on the desk beside Lyra's work and said, "Today you present to the king." Lyra looked up. "Today I what?" she said, which was not a question. Maret's expression held the precise quality of someone who has decided to be very calm. The review comes every 7 years. His Majesty inspects the hall. Every keeper presents. She paused. "You've been here 7 years." There was something in her voice that Lyra did not understand until later. At the time she heard it as apology. "Ink under the nails," Maret added, quiet, almost to herself. "Wash your hands before the hour." Lyra washed her hands. The ink never entirely left the creases of her knuckles. It had been there so long she sometimes forgot it was ink and not skin. She stood third in line when the king entered the rune hall's upper chamber, and she did not look at him when he came in, because everyone else had stopped looking, and the pressure of that collective arrested attention told her where he stood without requiring her to confirm it. She could feel the shift in the room, the way she could feel a structural rune in a wall. Not with her eyes, not with any named sense, but in the understanding that the space had reorganized itself around a new fixed point. She looked when it was her turn. She had to. He was taller than she had registered from the corner of her vision, and older looking than his years, in the way of men who have stopped sleeping through the night, and his jaw carried a scar that angled from the left corner toward his chin, healed clean but not smooth. He held a square of inscribed stone in one hand, flat across his palm, and when the council secretary Horvin gestured her forward, Lyra stepped up and looked at the stone rather than at him, which was the easier direction. "Identify the inscription," Horvin said, and then, in a lower voice clearly not intended for her, A rune keeper's apprentice. Ink under the nails, I see. Do keep your fingers off the state stones. Girl. She identified the inscription. She did not touch the stone. She read it from the distance of half an arm's length, and she said carefully, a suppression rune, Old Tongue Third Period, configured for lichen grief bond attenuation, placed approximately 7 years ago. The outer ring shows maintenance, but the core inscription is original. She paused. Whoever laid this had unusually clean line work. She said nothing else. The king looked at her with an expression she could not name, and then he extended the stone an inch closer. And her fingertips brushed the edge where his hand began, and her collarbone did something she had never felt it do. It was not pain, it was presence. A low heat against the inside of her sternum, specific and deep, like a coal laid there by someone who had been waiting outside and who had finally come in. She pulled her fingers back and her face did not move. Proximity to a lichen king always disrupted rune-sensitive skin. She knew this. It was documented. It was not remarkable. She returned to her place in the line. Behind her, Varric's leather cuff pressed against the inside of his left wrist. And beneath it, something that had been cold and absent for 7 years burned with the particular quality of a found thing. He said nothing. She left the hall. Neither of them knew yet what had just begun. The ash moon arrived in 3 days. Lyra knew this because every rune layer in the keep knew it, and because Dravan had sent her a written reminder folded in the formal council style. The High Rune Warden's reminders always arrived in the formal style. He had been sending her one every 7th year since she was an infant, which she had not understood until recently and now understood completely. The note said only that her health seal required maintenance before the moon's peak, and that she should present to his office at the second bell of the following evening. She had not presented. She had not presented the evening before that either. What she had done instead was go to the deepest shelf of the lower archive and pull down a ledger she had read twice before and never shown anyone, and read it a third time. The ledger contained the registration records of every suppression seal placed by the Rune Council in the years spanning Lyra's birth, and the 6 years before it. There were many seals in those years. The council had been very busy. She found her own entry on the 43rd page, written in Draven's hand, and she recognized his script now, the same slightly elongated downstroke on his Old Tongue characters, the same habit of pressing hard on the second rune of any 3-part inscription. The entry named her date of birth. It named her mother. It named the seal as a 3-layer compound, huskward outermost, null brand in the middle, sealing mark innermost. The sealing mark, the entry noted, required reinscription every 7th year to maintain integrity. If allowed to degrade past the point of the ash moon's peak, the entry read in Draven's careful hand, the bearer would experience escalating bond sensation leading to systemic rupture within 1 to 3 days. A full degradation. Systemic rupture. She had seen what that looked like. She had been 12 years old when she saw it. The collarbone had been aching since the morning of the review. Not pain at first, just that same cold warmth, that new and unwelcome presence. By the second evening, it had deepened to something closer to a bruise, a spreading pressure along the left side of her chest, and Lyra had sat at her desk with her palm flat against her collarbone, and her jaw set and her lamp burning low, and made herself think very carefully about what she knew and what she intended to do with it. She knew the innermost seal was cracking. She knew Draven had delayed the reinscription deliberately, twice rescheduled, twice with a different excuse, which meant he wanted her afraid enough to comply without reading the ledger first. She knew what the rune on her collarbone actually was. She had translated it 3 weeks ago, using a mirror and a rubbing she'd made of the impression on her own skin, matching the character forms to the archive's reference charts for Old Tongue bond script. It was a suppression seal, not a health seal, not a ward against bond sickness, a suppression placed over a bond mark at birth, designed to prevent the mark from burning or being felt or being sensed by the counterpart across any distance. She did not know whose counterpart she was. She did not know whose mark she carried. That was what Dravan had hidden inside 3 layers of craft. And she had not yet found the record that named the king. If she let the seal degrade fully, she might die. If she went to Dravan, she would let him reinscribe the rune, and she would never know what was beneath it. And she would spend the rest of her life maintaining seals for other people's suppressants, and believing the quiet in her collarbone was her natural condition. She stayed at the desk. She breathed through the ache. She did not go to Dravan. She was in the passage outside the lower archive at the second bell of the third night, on her way back from the hall, because she had needed the lamp and had stayed too late, when the pain sharpened past what she could walk through. It arrived suddenly, a crack of pressure across the left side of her chest that dropped her hand to the wall and then down to one knee on the cold stone, her other hand pressed against her collarbone through the wool of her tunic. She was counting her breath. She was very carefully not making noise. The passage was empty and dark, and she had managed worse. She was almost certain she had managed worse. "Get up," said a voice from behind her. She did not get up. She turned her head and looked, because there was nothing else to do. And Varric stood at the far end of the passage with a lamp in his hand, and an expression she could not read at this distance. She had not heard him approach. He moved very quietly for a man of his size, and at this particular moment she resented it. "I am fine," she said, which was technically true in that she was still conscious. "My lord," she added, because protocol survived pain. He walked the length of the passage and crouched in front of her, setting the lamp on the floor between them, and looked at her hand pressed to her collarbone and then at her face. His own face was unreadable in the lamplight. "What is under your hand?" he said. It was not framed as a question. She considered her options. "A seal that is degrading," she said, because a lie would have been both insulting and visible. "I am aware of it. I am managing it." Something shifted behind his eyes. "Not concern." Exactly. She read him wrong. She would realize later, but recognition. The kind of recognition that had been 7 years waiting for a name. "Who placed it?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight and then said, "The High Rune Warden, the night I was born." The silence after that was very particular. She felt his wrist move under the leather cuff, not a visible motion, just a tension in the tendons. And she filed this away without understanding it. "Can you walk?" he said. "Yes," she said. He offered his hand. She did not take it, but she stood. And he let her, and he walked beside her back to the hall, without ordering her to Draven's office, and without explaining why he had been in the passage at that hour. She did not ask. She thought, turning into the lamp warmth of the hall, that he had wanted to say something else. She thought he had decided against it. She turned at her desk, and he was already gone, and her collarbone ached steadily in the dark. She did not see him again that night. She sat at the inscribing table with the lamp burning down to a stub and thought about what had just happened, which was that the king of the Ironhold had asked her name and walked her back from the passage floor and stood at the edge of her work table for 3 minutes before leaving without a word. She thought about the way his wrist had moved under the cuff. She thought about the leather of the cuff itself, dark and well worn, the kind of wear that comes from something pressed against the inside of it, something the wearer checks by feel, in private moments, to confirm it has not changed. She set this observation beside her other carefully kept knowledge and said nothing about it to anyone. In the morning, before the hall opened, there was a wooden tray on the step outside the lower archive door, bread from the kitchens, a covered dish of salted meat, a small clay pot of something warm. No note, no explanation. She looked at it for a long moment, then picked it up and brought it inside. The seal on her collarbone ached less that morning than it had the night before, and she was not certain whether this was physical or only the effect of having eaten before the work began. The morning of the second day before the Ashmuj, Merrick came to find her with a summons she had not expected. "Draven wants your progress logs." Marit said, setting the folded paper on Lyra's desk without quite looking at it. 3 years of inscription records, reviewed and signed. She paused. Her hands were resting on the desk's edge, and they were very still. He asked for mine as well, all 20 years of them. Lyra looked at her. Marit was 71 years old and going blind, and had been inscribing seals for the council since before Dravan had his post, and her logs were the most comprehensive record of the hall's work in living memory. He said, Marit continued carefully, that if the records showed any irregularity, my ink right would be referred to the full council for review. She lifted her eyes. My ink right is all I have left, little ink hand. She did not say it. She did not need to. She did not need to. Lyra folded her hands in her lap. She thought about what Maret's ink right meant, the pension, the chamber, the craft that had defined the old woman's life. She thought about what Draven wanted in exchange, Lyra's compliance, Lyra's silence, her presence under his stylus before the Ash Moon Peak. She thought about her mother and the severance ritual that Dravan had called bond sickness, which she had found described in the archive ledger in very different terms. She said, Has he reviewed your logs yet? Not yet, Marit said. He'll call for them at the third bell. Lyra stood. I need the morning, she said. I need access to the archive. Marit looked at her for a long moment with her failing eyes and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, and moved aside. What Lyra found in the archive that morning was not a surprise. It had the quality of a thing she had been expecting to find for a long time. Her mother's registration was on page 17 of the same ledger, written in the same hand, the same careful script, the entry filed under severance ritual, voluntary year 180. Below the notation, the presenting symptoms were bond sickness, systemic destabilization. Below that, in a smaller note written as an afterthought, the mark origin was listed as the Ember Moon line. Bonded to reigning king. Suppressed from birth per council directive, seal maintenance lapsed. She read it twice. She turned back to her own entry. 43rd page, the same phrase, the Ember Moon line, the same notation, bonded to reigning king. She sat very still in the lampless archive, with the ledger open in her lap, and understood. In the cold, factual way she had learned to understand hard things, that her mother had not died of bond sickness. Her mother had died of the same degradation that was currently spreading across her own left collarbone. Dravan had let the seal lapse deliberately. Maintenance lapsed, the ledger read, as if it had simply been forgotten. He had not forgotten. He had let her mother die and recorded it as a natural progression because a living ember moon, Luna bonded to the king, would have access to the founding seals, and the founding seals were the source of the Rune Council's power, and Dravan had been protecting that power for 40 years. Lyra set the ledger flat and pressed her palm to the page to stop her hand from shaking. And then she did what she had been doing since she was 12. She made herself breathe, and she made herself think, and she made a plan. She brought Marit's logs to Draven's office at the third bell, exactly as requested. She said nothing about the archive. She said nothing about her mother. She sat across from Draven's desk while he reviewed the logs with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had never been caught, and she watched his hands and his eyes and the way he turned pages, and she filed everything she saw. He said at the end that the logs were satisfactory and that her maintenance appointment remained scheduled. Third bell tomorrow, he said. Do not be late. She said she would not be late. She left his office and went back to the hall and sat at her desk until the building was empty. And then she put the tips of her fingers against her collarbone and felt the seal cracking. And she knew there was one more thing she needed to do tonight. The hall in the late night hours smelled of cold stone and dead lamps and the faint iron of dried ink, and Lyra moved through it the way she had moved through it for 7 years, by the pattern of her own footsteps and the memory of every corner. She went to the lowest archive shelf and pulled down the reference volume for old tongue bond script. She had 3 hours before the second bell. The blood rune for the Ember Moon call mark took 8 strokes in the correct. sequence, and the sequence mattered absolutely, and she practiced it in the air with her fingertips 6 times before she made a single cut. She used the small knife she kept in her kit for trimming nib points, and the cut was shallow and precise in her left palm. And she pressed her hand flat to a practice stone from the supply shelf and held it. Nothing happened, which was expected. The practice stone was plain granite with no resonant properties. What would happen in a stone wall under the right conditions, with the right seal already cracking on her collarbone, was a different question. She did not know the answer. That was the part the literature had not answered clearly, which was also why she had waited until there was no other option. She cleaned her hand. She put the reference volume away. She went back to her desk and watched the lamp oil lower until the third bell rang across the keep. And then she went to the holding cell as instructed, because Dravan had put the summons in writing and she had read it. And she preferred to be arrested on record, rather than to disappear quietly, in a way the archive might never show. The arrest came at dawn on the day of the ash moon. 2 council guards, Horvin behind them with the charge sheet folded in his hand, and the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for this particular morning. Willful degradation of a state suppression seal, Horvin read aloud, and his voice carried the hall with the practiced ease of someone who enjoyed the carrying. The girl has ruined herself. The guards had her arms, and the holding cell was beneath the council chamber, and Draven himself locked the door. Bond fraud from a bondless? Horvin had said in the corridor outside, shaking his head at a guard who had asked him something. Almost funny. She's maintained other people's seals for 7 years and let her own go to ruin. He laughed, a small sound, and moved on. She sat in the dark of the holding cell and listened to the sounds of the council chamber being prepared above her, benches dragged, braziers lit, the procedural arrangements for a severance ritual. Not a reinscription, a removal. She had known he would choose removal. It was cleaner. It left no mark to burn back through. What she had was the opposite wall of the holding cell, which was rough stone, and the cut on her palm from 3 nights ago, where she had tested the blood rune theory against a practice piece in the archive. What she had was 23 years of a seal she had never felt and could now feel completely. A steady burning pressure against the inside of her left collarbone, specific and warm, and for the first time in her life, entirely unambiguous in what it was trying to tell her. She pressed her cut palm to the wall and formed the character in Old Tongue with her own. Blood, drawing it carefully in the dark by touch alone, the call mark of the Ember Moon line, the oldest rune in the archive. So old it predated the council's founding, and was therefore not in any register Dravan could suppress. She had read about blood rune theory in 4 different sources, and never attempted it because the literature on it was unambiguous. Uncontrolled blood rune in an untrained practitioner could rupture the bearer's own seals before the signal resolved. She was 23 years old, 3 hours from a lethal severance ritual, and the seal over her bond mark was already cracking. She pressed harder. She held the mark until she felt it complete, a warmth under her palm against the stone, brief and resonant, a pulse that went outward from the wall and kept going. She sat back in the dark and waited. Above her, Varric felt it at the first bell of dawn. He had been awake since the 2nd hour of the night, standing at the window of his private study with his left wrist unguarded, feeling the warmth that had been building there since the night of the review sharpened, degree by degree, into something that was not warmth anymore, but demand. The Ember Moon pulse arrived through the wall of his study like a hand, gripping his wrist from the inside. And his wolf went silent, and then went completely still, the way a great predator goes still before it moves. He knew what the Ember Moon line was. He had known since the archivist he had set hunting for the source of his silenced bond had sent him the first document 3 years ago, and the second a year later, and had gone silent after the third, which was when Varric had understood that someone in the council was watching the search. He had waited. He had been very patient. He had 23 years of practice at patience. He crossed the keep in 7 minutes and took the stairs to the council chamber at the pace of a man who has decided what he is doing and will not be redirected by any force short of the structural. He had been mateless for 7 years, which was not the same thing as being alone, but was close enough that the difference had stopped mattering. The bond had gone cold before he could locate it, and the silence in his wrist had the shape of an absence with edges, a specific weight where there should have been warmth. He had employed 3 different archivists over those years, quietly and at some personal risk, to trace the source of the suppression. The first 2 had stopped sending reports after the 3rd month. The third had managed 6 months and 1 incomplete document before going silent, and after that Varric had understood that whoever had placed the seal was watching for exactly this kind of search, and had set his own patience against theirs, and had made sure to be in the Rune Hall personally for the 7-year review. He had not known what he expected to find. He had not expected the woman with ink-stained fingers who read the suppressed seal without touching the stone, who named the craft and the age and the hand with complete composure, and then met his eyes for 1 second before she looked away, and his wrist went from cold to burning in the fist of a breath. He had been mateless for 7 years, which was not the same thing as being alone, but was close enough. The bond had gone cold before he could locate it, and the silence in his wrist had been the kind of silence that has a shape too. It an absence with edges. He had employed 3 different archivists over those years, quietly, to trace the origin of the suppression. The first 2 had stopped sending reports after the 3rd month. The third had managed 6 months and 1 incomplete document before going silent. He had understood after the third that whoever had placed the seal was watching for exactly this kind of search, and had waited, and planned differently, and made sure to be in the Rune Hall personally for the 7-year review. He had not known what he expected to find. He had not expected the woman with stained fingers, who read his suppressed seal without touching the stone, who named the craft and the age and the hand with complete composure, and then met his eyes for 1 second before she looked away and his wrist went from cold to burning in the span of a breath. Thresh was behind him, with 4 guards, no command given, no command necessary. The chamber doors were not locked. He pushed them open. Dravan was standing at the ritual circle with his stylus and the ceremonial dish of binding. Ink and 2 council members flanking him, and at the circle's edge stood Lyra with her wrists held by a guard on each side. Her collarbone visible above the torn edge of her collar, where the skin had been cleared for the stylus. The mark burned on her left collarbone like a coal through cloth, and across the chamber Varric's left wrist burned inside his cuff. Dravan turned. The council members turned. Horvin turned, from his position near the door, and his mouth closed on whatever he had been about to say. The chamber was quiet. "Release her," Varric said. Dravan's voice was smooth. He had a lifetime of smooth. "My lord. There is a procedural matter underway, the removal of an unstable seal. We need only a few moments to complete the ritual before the seal degrades. Further, and endangers the hall staff, a precaution strictly within the council's standard authority, if you would allow us to finish." He spoke for a long time. He was very good at speaking for a long time. Varric listened to none of it. He looked at Lyra, who was looking back at him, and he pushed back the leather cuff on his left wrist and let the Council of 12 see the mark there, the mate mark. 7 years burning cold and now burning hot, gold-lit, and unmistakable. The room understood before he said it. "She is mine," he said. "Every rune you laid on her is void." It happened in the seconds that followed, before anyone else could speak. The outermost rune on Lyra's collarbone went first, the husk ward, extinguishing in a thin line of gold light that rose from her skin like smoke and vanished. Marette, who had been standing near the far wall since Dravan had required her presence as procedural rune witness, stepped forward with her old blind woman's deliberateness and said in the silence, "Husk word, old tongue compound suppression, outer layer, configured to prevent the bearer's mark from registering sensation. The inscription is dated to the 180th year of the Ironhold. She said it the way she said everything, as fact, not testimony. She had been keeping her own records for 20 years, as it happened. She had her own ledger. It was already open in her hands. The null brand went second, another thread of gold light dissolving upward from the skin. And Merritt said without pausing, null brand, middle layer, suppression of directional bond sensing in the counterpart. Placed within hours of the husk word, same hand, same date. The Council of 12 was very still. Dravon's stylus had not moved. He was looking at the mark on Varric's wrist, and the steadiness of his face had the quality of a structure whose supports have been cut, but which has not yet understood that it is falling. The innermost seal went last and loudest. The sealing mark cracked outward from the center of Lyra's collarbone in a line of gold light that did not vanish upward but spread, running along her left collarbone to the shoulder, and the mark under it emerged whole and clear and burning, the mate mark, the specific pattern of the bond, the same character for character as the one on Varric's wrist. Merritt read the last rune's old tongue, meaning into the silence of the chamber without hesitation, without drama, in the voice of a woman who has been waiting 20 years to say exactly this: sealing mark, innermost layer, placed at birth, configured to suppress a bonded Luna's mark in perpetuity, subject to maintenance every 7th year, or the bearer suffers systemic bond rupture. She paused one beat. The same configuration was applied to the bearer's mother in the 1173rd year. The mother's maintenance was allowed to lapse in the 1180th year. The mother died on the 3rd day of the ash moon that year. She closed the ledger. The High Rune Warden's hand is on every inscription I have described. Dravon moved. Thresh moved faster. The 4 guards moved with Thresh. There was a brief struggle, and then there was not. And the procedural dish of binding ink had fallen to the stone floor, and the stylus was not in Draven's hand anymore. And in the ringing stillness of the chamber, Lyra was standing at the edge of the ritual circle, without anyone holding her arms. Her collarbone open to the cold air and the mark burning, clear and warm and fully present for the first time in 23 years. Every layer of silence burned away. She looked at Varric, 12 feet of cold stone floor between them. The full council of 12 on their feet in various degrees of shock, Horvin near the door with a very specific expression on his face. The expression of a man who has made a career of being on the correct side of power, and who cannot currently identify where that side is. Varric walked to her. He was not in a hurry. He had the steadiness of a man who has finished waiting. He stopped when he was close enough that she could see the match clearly, his mark and hers, the same. The bond that had burned cold on his wrist for 7 years and had been pressed under 3 layers of craft on her collarbone, since the night she was born. And he looked at her for a long moment, and then he did what she had not expected. He put one knee on the stone floor of the council chamber, before the Council of 12, before Thresh and the guards, before Horvin near the door with his charge sheet still folded in his hand. He went down on one knee and he held his marked wrist toward her, open, and he said nothing else. She had already heard what he needed to say. She had heard it when he walked through the door. She put her marked hand in his. The bond steadied, warm and complete, and it was nothing like what she had been afraid of. It was nothing like a rupture. It was nothing like the sound her mother had made in those last 3 days. It was quiet. It was the coal finally given air. The council chamber had the particular silence of a room in which something has just become permanent, and no voice broke it. Because even Horvin understood, looking at the 2 marks burning identically gold in the cold dawn light, that the charges he was holding had become something the ledger in Merritt's hands had already made meaningless. The formal tribunal convened in 7 days. Horvin, who had read the charges aloud with his practiced carrying voice and laughed in the corridor and called the arrest almost funny, was among the witnesses required to testify. He testified with the same meticulous composure he brought to everything. He had a talent for reading which side of a shift was the correct one, and afterward he took considerable care to make himself invisible in the corridors of the keep, which was a new experience for him and which Lyra observed with the quiet satisfaction she permitted herself on the matter. Horvin, who had read the charges aloud, with his practiced carrying voice, and laughed in the corridor and called the arrest almost funny, was among the witnesses required to testify. He testified accurately. He had a talent for reading which side of a shift was the correct side, and he testified with the same meticulous composure he brought to everything. And afterward he took considerable care to make himself invisible in the corridors of the keep, which was a new experience for him, and which Lyra observed with the dry private satisfaction she permitted herself on the matter. Draven's stylus right was stripped by vote of 11 of the 12 council members, the 12th abstaining on grounds of self-incrimination, which abstention was itself recorded and referred for further inquiry. The Ember Moon suppression records were unsealed by the same vote and placed in the hall's public archive. 3 other council members whose signatures appeared in the relevant registration ledgers were referred to separate proceedings, and Moret was named to the oversight body, charged with reviewing all suppression seals placed in the iron holds preceding 40 years, and determining which had been laid under legitimate authority and which had not. She accepted the post on the condition that Lyra be named her deputy. The condition was accepted. The Rune Hall was different in the weeks that followed. Not physically different. The stone was the same stone. The lamps burned the same oil. The smell of iron filings was unchanged. But the suppression seals on the lower hall's working ledger were being crossed off one by one, and in their place a new category of inscription had been added to the register, which Lyra had titled freeing seals, the name Lyra had chosen, runes drawn in old tongue bond script that dissolved illegitimate suppressions without harm to the bearer. She had spent 3 nights working out the composition, and had shown her work to Maret, who had read it carefully and said only, "Clean line work." Lyra had laughed, which surprised her, because she could not remember when she had last laughed. She was at her old work table on the morning Varric came in. The table was the same table, the archive shelves were the same shelves, and her ink was the same ink, but the work under her hands was the first freeing seal to be used in the iron hold in 400 years. And Merritt sat across from her, tracing the reference forms with her careful blind woman's fingers, and murmuring corrections where the line weight was off. Varric's shadow arrived first, and then his hand on the edge of the table, and he said nothing, which was his way of asking. Lyra did not look up. The mark on her collarbone was warm and steady, not the demanding burn of something trying to break through 3 layers of suppression. Not the coal-needing air, but the simple warmth of a hearthstone in winter, present and constant, and entirely without urgency. She did not need to look up to know where he was. She finished the inscription. She set the stylus down, and the rune hall was warm.